If you hate mixing or you're stuck because your beats sound good but never quite finished, then this video is for you. I'm not a mix engineer, I'm just a beat maker that uploads beats daily, and I needed a way to mix fast without overthinking or getting stuck, you know, EQing a snare for 1 hour. So in this video, I'm going to show you the exact method that I use to get my beats sounding loud, clean, and sellable without spending hours getting lost in all the technical scientific aspect. And make sure you stick around because I'm going to tell you the one trick that changed everything for me and made mixing so much easier, so don't miss that. Okay, so to show you my mixing method from scratch, I've got this beat which has got a guitar, piano, bell, strings, bass, and then we've got the drum layers, which is kick, snare, hats, more hats, and then perk break. Now this is a typical sort of boom bap track. You know, you've got a bit of MIDI, some samples, drums, dirty drums because of the break. So we need to mix it in a way that sounds clean, do it relatively quickly, and make sure that there's plenty of space for the artist and that it sounds consistent with other beats on YouTube. And by the way, make sure you're subscribed because next week's video is going to be me showing how I arrange this full beat. First things first, referencing. Being able to reference your mixes to someone else's mix is the biggest thing that you can do to increase your skill at mixing. If you can't compare it to something, then you're sort of like a fish lost at sea. And I think that analogy makes no sense. But essentially, you need to find beats that you like, beats that sound clean, popular beats as well. So it's good practice to have a folder of reference tracks. I've got a few here, and I'll put a link in the description to my favorite YouTube producer whose beats sound insanely clean, I think. But then what you would do is just use that as a comparison. So this is one that I've been using recently by False Ego. So the way I use the reference track is just put a span on it. This is a free plugin that you need to have. If you don't, then just get it immediately. And we're going to be using this a bit later as well. But if you just play the beat, then you can get an idea of what's going on. So we can see how pronounced the lower end is. You can see it's peaking at 0. Because obviously there's a limiter on it. So you just use that as a reference point when it comes to doing your own beat, understanding how sounds are working with each other. So how loud the clap is or the snare compared to the kick, or how loud the sample, the melody is compared to everything else. So that's the first most important thing. So I always use a reference when I'm mixing, even if it's just for a minute or two, just to get an understanding of levels. But we'll get rid of that now because we don't need it for this. Okay, so before we start going on to all the layers, let me just show you what the track sounds like now. Nothing panned, everything at 0, no EQ, nothing. So yeah, that sounds really messy, distorted, not so great. So what we're going to do to start off is mute the melody. Let's work on the drums first because that's going to be the most important thing. We need the kick to be driving the track. So usually that's like an anchor point that everything's based around. So the way I like to do it is starting off by just turning the levels down. We want to do the leveling and panning first, and then we'll start going into the EQ and things like that. I tend to have it around -4, -5 sometimes. And then I'll put a few plugins on here. So first thing is I like to have the kick mono always. So I just put utility on it. And then an EQ. I use the stock Ableton EQ a lot because it's really quick and easy to use to do like basic things. I like to take out frequencies below sort of 20. When it comes to levels, I used to do the thing of having everything like at -12 to start off with. But what I do now is just do levels at whatever point, and then afterwards on the master bus, just turn down the gain to whatever I want it to. And you'll see when we get to that point what that includes. So we've got the kick and then the snare. The snare and the kick together have to be at the right level. That's the most important thing. Then again, EQ. So a lot of the time people will mention about taking out all frequencies below like 100 or so because you want the kick and the bass to get all of that low end headroom. So usually I'll stick to that. There's a few nuances to it, but for this, let's just take out everything there. We want to make sure we don't get rid of any of the sort of mid section because the snare needs that. So you see that frequency. We don't want to chop that off because then you get a weak snare. Next, we'll do the hats. Now, when it comes to panning, kick and snare always central. Hats, if there's only one hat layer, I'll keep it central, but if there's more than one, then I'll do some panning. So in this case, we've got hats, slow hats and more hats. So I'll show you what they are. These are the slow hats. Pretty self-explanatory. And then more hats is this loop that's just got a bit more going on with it. So what are we going to do? Levels down. Again, it's all about how it works with the kick and the snare. So you can see I'm just soloing each one at a time, adding to the previous ones. Again, the hats, you don't want them to be too overpowering, especially when you've got multiple layers of them, which I tend to do, like 2 or 3 different hat layers with perks. So we can just turn it down. And again, EQ. So a lot of the time these samples don't have much going on, but just in case. So yeah, we'll just do that. And again with more hats. It just doesn't need anything there. All that's going to do is muddy up the mix because you're just going to be building up frequencies that aren't needed. They're not contributing in any way. So just remove them. Now, in terms of the panning, when I've got multiple layers of hats, I just like to do one to the left, one to the right. And this is just based on preference, really. You can keep them central. Now on my sends, I've got a Valhalla vintage verb and a delay, and then I've just EQ'd out everything below 100. So this is the reverb that I'm going to use on any drum sounds. I don't like to use a lot, depending on the beat, sometimes you will, but in this case, we can just put a touch on both those hats. So if we put it up, obviously that's too extreme. So just a little touch of it can be nice. Sometimes on the snare as well, but a lot of the time you need it to be dry so it can cut through better. Okay, so this is what we've got so far. Finally, we've got Perks Break. Now this is an important one. When I'm doing boom bap beats, I need to have some texture and crunch and noise, which I'll get from like a drum loop or a break and layer it in with my own sounds. But it can't be too overpowering, of course. So at the moment, this is what it sounds like. So again, we'll put an EQ on there, and I'm also going to do a kickstart. So anything that you can use for side chaining, track spacer, soothe, kickstart, a compressor, shaper box, whatever. And then I'm just going to audio and then side chain to the kick so that every time the kick hits, it ducks. So you can see that's quite drastic. And then I'm also going to EQ out some of that lower end because it's more like the noise and texture and the crunch of the higher end that I want in this. And we'll probably turn this down as well, but let's play all the drums and see how it fits together. More of that in there. So the band, we're going to just allow everything below this frequency to be what ducks. Cool. So the drums are sounding a lot cleaner now, a lot nicer. And then what I need to do is the group processing. So I'm going to be straight up. I don't like compression. It's one of those things that just, it hurts my head and I can't really use it in a way where it works as well as I'd like to. So I'm very minimal with compression. So the first thing I'm going to do on the drum bus is, you've seen this on my other videos probably, is the OTT. This is one of my favorite plugins to use on all sorts of things because it's really easy to use and it always does something cool. So I'll put it downward to 0 and then depth down to 0 and then slowly increase it. I would never go above 20% on this, like that's just too extreme. Just gives it some extra oomph, you know? So next up I put a Pro Q3. This is where I can get a bit more surgical with the EQ. And this is more just to tame any wilder frequencies or do some boosts in very small areas. So usually the offensive area is going to be like a hi-hat, a snare, or a kick. Obviously, I could just go to the hi-hat layers and just change them, but I don't know. I just feel like it's better to do everything all in one. So there's a gap here that I might boost a little bit. There's such minimal edits, and I'm just doing it by feel, hearing, and trying not to be too visual, because one mistake you can make is mixing in a visual sense and not listening to what you're doing, and that's usually a recipe for disaster. As the saying goes, you should always mix with your ears, not your eyes. So at this point I would leave them and then move on to the bass. I want the bass to work with the kick and the drums as well as possible. This is a sort of make or break aspect of the beat. Let's listen to the bass first by itself. It's really simple. And I tend to use a bass guitar a lot, especially for boom bap. Again, it's going to be a few simple things. So Pro Q3, I like to use this just to get a visual sense of what's going on. So let's play it with the kick. Now obviously the first thing is a sidechain. That's the most important thing. If you've not got an individual kick sample and you're using like a break, then Track Spacer or Soothe 2 is a better bet. But I try to always do a kick as its own thing because you have so much more control. So audio, choose the kick. It makes a big difference pretty much immediately, and you don't need to do too much else. The level, I don't need to do too much either. But what I will do, and this is something that I love doing on my bass, and I've done it for years, is a Fab Filter Satin as a way to get some more saturation. You need saturation. I think on the bass it's like the most important thing. So I'm going to turn it off below here. Everything in the high end, turn it off as well. You can do this in any sort of plugin really, but just something to add some specific saturation in a sort of mid-range. Saturation gentle. And you don't need to do too much. A lot of subtlety is needed when it comes to mixing in general. So without, and then with. So that's all we need to do. There's a few other plugins I like to use for bass depending on the track. Something that I'm using a lot recently is RBass, because this is really good for, again, small speakers, getting the bass to be heard. So this is why I had the Pro Q3, because then I can see the frequency that needs to be adjusted in the RBass. By the way, one thing that I always do is put an EQ at the end of any plugins and effects and things, because I want the EQ usually to be adjusting what I'm hearing after all of those plugins have been put into place. Okay, so I think that's okay for the bass. Now we go on to the melody. This can be relatively simple in boom bap because a lot of the time you're using like a couple of samples and a couple of MIDI layers. In other genres, it can get a bit more crazy, but this is pretty easy. So we've got a guitar. It's got an effect track on there doing some cool wah-wah stuff. That's just part of the effect that I wanted on there. So first things first, again, EQ. It's always the first step. So just going to take out everything below 100. And I want the guitar pans left. Now, when it comes to melodic sounds, I'm panning. I don't want anything in the middle, to be honest, unless it's like a really like low mid sound, sometimes a piano. So the guitar is one of the main chord foundational melodic ideas. So just a little bit to left, turn it down. Now, obviously, it's about how it works with the kick and the drums and everything else we've done. But before we do that, I'm just going to go through layer by layer, lower them, EQ them, and then play it all together. And then it's easier to tweak. So this is usually a really quick thing. So EQ, pan, turn it down. The reverb and the delay, I'm going to leave that because it's already got enough reverb and stuff on there. If I needed reverb, I'd use these sends. Piano. So that's going to be to the right. Get out the way. Now on the piano, I'm actually going to put a Pro Q3 because pianos are quite difficult to work with, I find sometimes. You need to be a bit more surgical with them. Obviously, a guitar and a piano tend to take up the same space as well, so we just want to be wary of that. So EQ everything below 100 out. So you can see all of these here. Now, one trick you can do, which I do quite often, is if you put a Pro Q3 on the guitar as well, and now we go to the piano, we can just click here and we can see. So now the red line is the guitar. And this just helps us figure out what we need to duck or cut. So we can see they're taking up very similar frequencies, so we just need to be mindful. So we can turn them down, pan them out the way. We can maybe allow the piano to have more of the lower mids, take out more of the higher end. Because then in the guitar, we can have it having more of the higher end. And obviously you can see the red like shadow is saying this is where the clashing is happening. So just keep that in mind. So you don't need to do too much, but you just have to be mindful of the impact on one sound on another. Let's bring in that bell. So you can see this is why we low cut, because it's got all of that low information that is not needed. Much better. And now pan this. I'm going to pan it far to the right, and it's going to be wider than the piano. This is really like, I love how this sounds in headphones when you've got things panned in every single direction. And again, lowering it, we don't need it that loud. And then the strings, opposite side. So I like to have a lot of symmetry when I'm doing the mixing in terms of the panning, because it can be a bit lopsided if you end up having too many things to the left and just one thing on the right. Again, just the EQ8, I don't need to do anything too surgical. Obviously, if you find frequencies that are like annoying or harsh, then you should go in and be a bit more surgical with those. This is the melody together. Now, an important thing is the group processing of the melody. But first, let's hear it in conjunction with the drums and the bass and everything. And then we can sort of decide if we need to do a lot more or not. The guitar can come down a little bit. Okay, so the group processing, I always throw on a shaper box because it has this one preset that does something I like. So we go to dynamics and then mix bus 1. So it's just a bit of compression and a bit of width, but hear how it sounds without and with. So So you can see it just brings it to life almost. It's obviously just adding a bit more shine on the higher end, but I just love the sound it brings. Okay, so now that we can hear everything together, that's where we can be a bit more surgical and fine tune a few elements. First thing, which I don't do all the time, but sometimes, sidechaining the melody group to the kick as well. We'll throw in a kick start again. We'll choose the kick, audio. It doesn't need to be that harsh, so I tend to just say, you know, everything below maybe 200. So it just gives a little bit more room, so whenever the kick hits, that pumping effect just gives you more bounce and groove. Okay, so now we go on to the the bus, and this is where you need a few things and you can make or break everything. So starting off, I will add a saturator, just the stock Ableton one, and this will just give all the saturation on everything you need. It's basically when you're doing the clipping thing, you know, that people always tell you to do. So I just go to soft clip, usually 1.5, never more than like 1.8 dB. You just need a touch of it. So without, and then with. Pretty good, right? Makes quite a difference. Then I'll put another Pro Q3 because you want to like fine tune a few things. So obviously there's a few things to know when it comes to EQ, like if you want to add shine, if you want to remove mud, things like that. For me, the biggest issue is usually between like 3 to 500 hertz where the mud can build up. So sometimes I'm just going to duck there. Really, really fine amounts though. Now, another big thing, like I mentioned before about having span, you need span because when you look at span, you can see obviously the reference we had before, the lower end had to be bigger. So we can use this as a way to see that. So we can see it's a little bit too even at the moment. So this tells me a few things. One, I need to turn down the hats. I want a bit more on the bass, just increase a few things. Now, one thing I love to do with span is if you go to presets and then go to mid-side stereo, we can see the mid-side image. So putting things in mono in the lower end has given us that headroom there. Because this light green here, that's all the side information and we don't need it in the lower end. It's just gonna take headroom that, you know, we can't afford to give it. And another thing is I don't want to see the side information go above the mid information. So this needs to be lower than that. So span is really useful. It's one of those things that will just make life a lot easier. Obviously, I said before, don't mix with your eyes, mix with your ears, but this helps just to get an understanding of where you are. Now, this is an important part. We're going to put the gain down to -6. So I mentioned, you know, about how I do levels. I can do them at whatever I want because I'm just going to drop everything by -6 because what I want in span is for this to stay no more than like -5 at most. So now what I do, this is an effect that I use a lot over the last few months, is this thing called oomph. Now, I'll be honest, I don't really know what it's doing. Sorry to say, I just don't know what's happening, but it sounds so good with it. So again, let me show you with and without. So this is without. I don't change anything, I just use that preset. I just like how it sounds, what it does to things. So if we check the span now with that on and with the gain at -6. So the last few tweaks before we do the limiter and export is just increasing that lower end a bit. So the kick. This is too much. And we can see when the bell goes higher pitched up an octave, it gets a little bit weird in the middle. So what we're going to do is a Pro Q3. And make it dynamic so that it's just not too overpowering. We can always turn the level down if we need to. sounding pretty cool, I think. Now, one thing that we need to do is a limiter. So one export that I do when I'm uploading to BeatStars is like this at -6. That's the headroom. So if people buy a license, they get this version where they can record on top of, and then they have all the headroom they need. So then we need a louder version. All I do is throw on a limiter, and you can use anything for this, but I just like using the stock one. In terms of getting the right level, I'm just going to increase the input gain, and to decide how loud I want it, I use this other free plugin, which is a must-have, Lean Loudness Meter. Get this because it's really useful. You can see the LUFS, and that's basically what I'm going to use it for. So this digit, I don't want it to be too low. Like if it's -6 is like a bit too low for me. I want it to be between like -7 to -9 usually. And this is for what's going to be on YouTube when people listen to the beats. So usually that's going to be around 11 dB on the input gain. And then the last thing that I'll do is put on one of my favorite plugins, which is Soothe 2. I'll put that after the utility, before the limiter, and I will change this depending on what issues the track may have. So in this case, where it's more about everything in the mids and the higher end, just the master bus preset does a pretty good job. So if we put the delta, we can hear what it's fixing. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of the video that there's one trick that I used that changed everything for me. And that trick is something I learned from watching a lot of live streams from Mixed by Ali. Obviously, he did a lot of Kendrick Lamar stuff. And he had this tip, which is just mixing in mono. Keep in mind that a lot of devices, when people listen to beats, are mono. You go to club systems, they're mono. So if you can make it sound good on mono, when you go back to stereo, it's going to sound like magic. It's pretty crazy, and it can be tough sometimes to get stuff sounding good in mono, so you just need to start figuring out how to do that. So utility, we'll just turn it to mono, see how it sounds. So usually the issues will arise with the melodic stuff, like guitars and pianos, when you go to mono, but then when you go back, like I said, it will sound good if you've done a decent job. So thanks for watching. I hope this video helped in some way. Make sure you leave a comment letting me know some tips and tricks that can help me with my mixing as well. Anything that you felt raised your level. And make sure you subscribe, because next week's video is going to be how to arrange boom bap beats using the same track. And if you want to see a video where I make a beat from scratch, beginning to end, showing the arranging, mixing, everything uncut, then check out this video right here.